Good evening, everyone, and I'm Victoria Dangle. I'm the Executive Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the Labor, Literature, and Landmarks Lecture Series, and in particular, the Landmarks Lecture Public Program. The Labor, Literature, and Landmarks Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would also like to acknowledge the New York Landmarks Conservancy, our partner for the Landmarks Lectures. We are also honored to be a part of the New York City Landmarks 50 Alliance and those related celebratory events. We are especially grateful to Barbara Lee Diamondstein-Spielvogel, Chair of the New York City Landmarks 50 Alliance. This evening's presentation is a particularly special Landmarks lecture. We are so honored to have the president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy speaking this evening on the 50th anniversary of the New York City Landmarks Law. And about the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, for those of you who perhaps are less familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit originally founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the city. Today, our 230-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of New Yorkers through our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, this library in which you are in this evening, and the facade of the building is a New York City landmark, and the building itself is listed on the on the National Register of Historic Places. It is now my pleasure to introduce the curator of the Landmark series, Lisa Easton, a partner in the New York City-based architecture and historic preservation firm, Easton Architects. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm honored to be a part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen 2015 Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. I always laugh because this is the third lecture I'm introducing, and that is a tongue twister. And when asked to curate the four-part Landmarks Lecture Series, I wanted to bring together a group of individuals who experience captures the essence of preserving our treasured landmarks, from technology of materials and methodology to advocacy and historic research. Tonight, I am honored to present Peg Breen, the president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Ms. Breen represents one of the oldest and largest preservation organizations in the United States. The Conservancy has loaned and granted more than $40 million and provided thousands of hours of technical assistance to individual homeowners, cultural and nonprofit institutions, businesses, and landmark religious institutions. This has contributed to more than $1 billion in preservation projects throughout New York City and New York State. The Conservancy also advocates the preservation at the local, state, and national levels. Ms. Breen embodies the essence of preservation in action. She is on the board of Save Ellis Island, the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, and Preservation Action. She serves on the advisory committee for Governor's Island and the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. She has also served on the boards of the Museum of the City of New York and the State Theater at Lincoln Center, and on the building committees for the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum. Peg's personal dedication and professional commitment to the mission of the Conservancy and its legacy stand as a statement to the evolution of preservation, and who better to lead us in celebrating the 50th anniversary of the landmark law in New York City than Peg Breen.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here to help in the celebrations. We have one of the strongest preservation laws in the country, and it continues to be a model for other cities. There is certainly a lot to celebrate. Just as the Society is, the Conservancy is part of the Landmarks 50 Alliance as well. It's a coalition of more than 180 groups and institutions, and we're all offering programs and exhibitions throughout the year celebrating what the law has meant to the city's economy, its tourism, and its quality of life. The Landmarks Law came about because people demanded it. They were upset about the loss of several important buildings, but the destruction of the glorious Pennsylvania station really galvanized concern. Mayor Robert Wagner signed the law 50 years and 2 days ago. The Conservancy was formed 8 years later, and I'm going to tell you a bit about our efforts through the years, but mostly I'm going to focus on some of the major threats to preservation today, even as our celebrations continue. As Lisa noted, we were always meant to go beyond advocacy and to have technical capacity, and we've developed several loan and grant programs through the years. I like to think of us as the Ghostbusters of preservation. Who are you going to call? Yeah. Our earliest work focused on threatened buildings in Lower Manhattan. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of each of these because they all took a lot of time and ingenuity. The federal government vacated Cass Gilbert's great custom house in 1973, but for some reason they let the young Conservancy take the lead in finding new uses for the building. The late and irreplaceable Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a great friend of the Conservancy, and he helped us establish the American Indian Museum there as part of the Smithsonian, and federal offices went back into the upper floors. The Conservancy stopped a developer from tearing down the entire Fraunces Tavern block in 1974. Mrs. Astor, another great friend of the Conservancy, gave us the money to buy the buildings. We then sold them to another developer who put in commercial and residential uses. We placed easements on the buildings, and now they are all landmarked. Mayor Beam wanted to tear down the Tweed Courthouse, citing the cost of repairs. Our longtime chairman, Brendan Gill, helped us raise funds to put a new roof on the building, and that convinced the mayor to let it be. We were once instrumental also in efforts to prevent the demolition of the 1886 Pier A at the mouth of the harbor and the end of the Hudson River. It was once a harbor fireboat station. We got it landmarked and put on the National Register, and we raised money and did a condition survey on it. It only took the city another 40 years to invest in its exterior restoration, and now a restaurant is finally opened in the building. As we say, you have to be in preservation for the long haul. Astor Row is a landmark block of 28 identical brick buildings with turned wood porches and little front yards on West 130th Street in Harlem. Mrs. Astor was intrigued by the name and gave us money to fix the porches. Here's what it looked like when we started in the late 1980s. This turned into a major multi-year project that went well beyond the porches. We worked with the city, the state, private banks, and the Abyssinian Development Corporation, and we even developed 2 abandoned buildings into limited equity co-ops. In the early 90s, we became involved in the south side of Ellis Island, a large abandoned hospital complex. The buildings had been left exposed to the elements and were surrounded by overgrown vegetation. We did structures reports on every single building and stabilized this one to show the National Park Service that it could be done for a reasonable amount of money. We helped lead a national campaign for federal funding to continue stabilization, and we now have a seat on the board of Save Ellis Island, a national group devoted to the South Side. We've been working to get a new train station in the landmark Farley Post Office since Senator Moynihan first proposed it in the mid-90s. And it was named, of course, Moynihan Station in his honor after his death. The first phase of underground work is pretty much complete. That was a lot of track work and new exits and entrances. And there are going to be 2 new entrances into the building on either side of the main staircase. We hope to see plans for a new Amtrak train hall in the next few months. As I mentioned, there are several panels and talks throughout the year on the 50th anniversary of the law. There was one last night, and an architect who wanted to move Madison Square Garden into the back of the Farley Post Office suddenly started denouncing all the preservation groups that prevented that from happening. And he said very angrily, "Don't believe them when they tell you that this could move all the traffic out of Penn Station. Well, I'm certainly glad the Conservancy opposed it, and Madison Square Garden should thank its lucky stars. The cost of bracing the interior Farley walls to hold the garden and the number of support columns that would have to be driven down among the train tracks under Farley would have been prohibitively expensive. Since train traffic was not to be interrupted, construction would have taken forever. And I don't remember anyone claiming that a station in Farley would take all the passengers out of Penn. But it will take the 30% of passengers who use Amtrak. And once you get 30% of the passengers out and all the Amtrak offices and paraphernalia, you finally have room to actually make improvements in Penn Station. Let's also remember what was going to replace the garden if it had moved into Farley. A gleaming new above-ground station? No. 2 office buildings, each the size of the Empire State Building. After 9/11, we worked with colleague groups to save the survivor staircase. This was the only above-ground element of the Trade Center left after the attack. Hundreds of people saved their lives on 9/11, fleeing down these stairs. We hired engineer Bob Silman to show the Port Authority how to remove the stairs and treads, and the staircase is now a centerpiece in the Memorial Museum. After Hurricane Sandy, we gave grants to a couple of dozen nonprofits damaged in the storm. Greenwood Cemetery lost hundreds of trees blown down by the wind, and they damaged several of the monuments. At the South Street Seaport, where the buildings were filled with 7 and 8 feet of water, we helped Bown & Company stationers, part of the Seaport Museum, save the wooden interior of their 1830s building. That's a few of our greatest hits, but it shows the diversity of our work and of New York's buildings. Many visitors think of us as a skyscraper city, but thanks to preservation, we have the greatest collection of architecture of any city in the country. More than 32,000 buildings are landmarked. So we also encourage New Yorkers to be tourists in your own town and get out and see what a remarkable city this is. Here are a few of our favorite spots to visit. George Washington used the Morris Jamel Mansion as his headquarters for a few months during the Revolutionary War. This house museum is open to visitors in Upper Manhattan. Alice Austin was one of the country's first female photographers. She lived in this lovely Gothic cottage on the Upper Bay. The house museum contains many of her photographs. About a dozen Dutch homes remain throughout the city. The Lott House is in southern Brooklyn. Weeksville was a thriving, free black settlement with hundreds of residents in the mid-1800s. Only 4 buildings remain, but it is well worth the trip to Crown Heights to see them. St. Paul's is the oldest building in Manhattan, and the pew George Washington worshiped in as president is still there. The 17th century Flushing Meeting House, to me, is one of the most remarkable buildings. Built in 1694, and it put on its modern edition in 1716. It is still used for worship today, and it hosts thousands of school children in the midst of this multicultural area that has grown up around it. And of course, Midtown boasts of iconic and well-known religious buildings. Now, the early commission focused on designating single buildings, but people demanded historic districts. Brooklyn Heights was the first, but there are now 114 with 21 extensions and more on the way. Our major cultural institutions are landmarked, and there's been an emphasis in recent years on designating more modern structures. Now, despite all the beautiful buildings and neighborhoods landmarking has protected, some of our real estate interests think New York should look more like this. They think Shanghai is eating our lunch commercially, though that hasn't been the case so far. And they insist that weakening the landmarks law is necessary for our economic growth. The Real Estate Board testified against the landmarks law 50 years ago. They warned that it would stifle the city economically, Despite all the evidence to the contrary, that's their story and they're sticking with it. For the last few years, Rebney has had a concerted campaign against landmarking, especially the creation of historic districts. And they've gotten some media support. Rebney was a driving force behind the Bloomberg administration's plans to upzone more than 70 blocks around Grand Central Terminal. The red squares on this map show what the Bloomberg planners called likely development sites. They all targeted the great masonry buildings around the terminal that give the area its character. The upzoning would have affected some 73 blocks, but what did they zero in on? The great landmark quality buildings around the station. There are two emphases that planners have now that I think can not always lead to good things. One is density. We must become a denser city. As someone on the panel said last night, there's density and there's congestion. And New York really has a lot of congestion already. Go down into Grand Central Terminal. The Bloomberg plan would have added 13,000 more riders every day. And they thought that really wasn't too bad. And I dared them to go down on that platform at 5:30 in the evening and announce that 13,000 more people would soon be joining them. The other thing that everyone says is that you have to build on top of the rail stations or the transit. New Yorkers are a hardy lot, and I bet even in future, New Yorkers would be able to walk a few blocks to get into a subway. But everybody wants to just pile on top of subway stations and make us dense. Here's what would have happened if the Bloomberg plan had passed, or what could have happened. Grand Central is buried somewhere in the midst of these hulking towers. Now, ultimately, a collection of preservation groups, community boards, transit advocates, some elected officials, and the Hotel Workers Union helped defeat the Bloomberg plan. But the victory was short-lived. Mayor de Blasio is also for taller buildings in Midtown. And he started by splitting off Vanderbilt Avenue for upzoning, and he's supporting a large new tower there. This beautiful Warren and Wetmore building is already being demolished at the corner of 42nd Street. The hope is to replace, not by us, is to replace it with a tower dubbed One Vanderbilt. The tower's fussy base would compete with the terminal, and it would rise higher than the Chrysler Building. There are other landmark quality buildings on Vanderbilt that could be threatened. The Yale Club by James Gamble Rogers, with its impressive details. 52 Vanderbilt is also by Warren and Wetmore, who were, of course, the architects of Grand Central. And the Roosevelt Hotel, an underappreciated gem. No wonder the figure on this hotel keystone looks so worried. We could find a solid wall of towers on Vanderbilt dominating the terminal. Now, the Landmarks Commission was invited to the table at the very end for both the Bloomberg and the de Blasio plans. I don't blame the commission. They're all appointed by the mayor, and clearly both Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio support upzoning, and they both support building One Vanderbilt. But former chair Bob Tierney did finally calendar 5 Midtown buildings. One is the Gray Bar building to the east of the terminal, once the largest office building in the country. 125 Park, south of the terminal across 42nd Street. It has lovely pink and white brickwork and wonderful solemn angel sentinels. Finally, 3 Lexington Avenue hotels, the Benjamin, the Marriott East, and the Radisson. Here are some of the wonderful and quirky details on the hotels. The current Landmarks Commission says there are some 42 Midtown buildings that could be considered for designation. The giant Postum building to the north of the terminal would be an obvious choice. But the owner has already expressed interest in replacing it with an even larger building if the area is upzoned. There are several wonderful buildings on Madison Avenue that could also be designated. And 2 more worthy hotels, the Intercontinental and the W. This is just a sample of the area's great architecture. Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer and Councilmember Dan Garodnick are leading a steering committee that is expected to offer proposals for the rest of Midtown in June. The committee has asked the Landmarks Commission to move on designations in the area now. Why not at least move on the 5 calendared buildings? But the LPC wants to wait until there is a plan for the area. The problem with that, of course, is that developers see taller buildings dancing in their heads. It's going to be incredibly difficult to designate new landmarks. The LPC did move quickly, however, to try and remove nearly 100 buildings from a list that had received initial hearings by prior commissions, but were never finally voted up or down. That plan drew so much opposition, the LPC was forced to postpone any action. The buildings they wanted to eliminate included lovely homes, towering religious buildings, a powerhouse designed by Stanford White, a Victorian gatehouse, and even a proposed historic district covering the Snug Harbor Cultural Center. The Conservancy again worked with Gail Brewer and our colleagues to come up with a practical way to deal with the list without overburdening the Commission. We presented our plan to the Commission recently, but we won't know until the beginning of May what the LPC intends to do. But we do believe that each building on the list deserves a hearing and a vote. The South Street Seaport is our only link to the city's early days when shipping fueled the city's economic rise. These buildings on Skirmerhorn Row are the oldest in the district, former commercial offices from the 1820s and 30s. They now contain the Seaport Museum and the remnants of the old hotel made famous by author Joseph Mitchell. The museum and its ships make our maritime history come alive. And the museum also controls this handsome row on Front Street. The historic district saved only a portion of what once was blocks and blocks of similar buildings. Most were destroyed before the early commission realized that what they considered modest buildings were worth landmarking. For decades, the city has turned to developers who promise revenue to the city and support for the Seaport Museum in return for being able to build new stores in the seaport. This is how Pier 17 looked after a Rouse Corporation development from the 1980s. It ultimately failed. Now the Howard Hughes Corporation is building a giant glass shopping mall to replace the old Pier 17. They also propose a large residential tower just outside the historic district on a pier jutting into the water. The tower is widely opposed as inappropriate next to the district and certainly vulnerable when the next superstorm Sandy hits. The company says it needs the revenue from the tower to help fund the museum and provide other public amenities. We think the museum should be independent, not tied to any developer. We also believe it should receive funding from the city, just as other museums on city-owned property do. We also object to plans to put affordable housing in Skirmerhorn Row. These are non-fireproof commercial buildings with no elevators or ADA access. Converting these buildings would be very expensive and destroy the heavy timber and other original material that has survived the centuries. We're not against affordable housing in historic buildings. There's plenty of affordable housing in historic districts and contextual districts, but it's just not practical to convert these buildings. The Howard Hughes Corporation is planning large developments outside the historic district where affordable housing could certainly go. Years ago, we worked with local investors to convince the city that the northern part of the district should not be given over to one developer. It should be developed organically by people who appreciated the area's history and character, and that's what happened. And that criteria should apply to the southern portion as well. We don't know how the Seaport fight will end, but we do know that we are in the process of losing some 30 to 40% of our city's extraordinary collection of religious buildings. You don't have to be religious at all to understand that these are important buildings with wonderful art and architecture. They show immigration patterns across the city, and many offer social service and cultural programs to the wider community. The closings announced by the New York Archdiocese have received the most attention, but many of these exceptional buildings are not landmarked, and they could be torn down, forever changing the character of neighborhoods. The closure list does include some landmark buildings, including one of my favorites, St. James, 1835 on the Lower East Side. It was actually founded by a Cuban priest who originally came from Cuba to take care of Irish immigrants. And obviously I have a soft spot for Irish immigrants. Landmark interiors of religious buildings are not landmarked. These sculptures are by Constantine Brumidi, who did the murals of the US Capitol. There's no protection for these murals when St. Scapular closes. And it's not just Catholic churches that are going to close. Other denominations, the Episcopals, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, all have declining congregations and revenues and are shutting their buildings. Landmark religious buildings can be adaptively reused, like this former Baptist church on the Upper West Side that's becoming residential. So is this giant Carrera and Hastings designed church at 96th and Center Park West. The community opposed turning this into apartments, but there were no other viable plans. So we're going to face a lot of compromises if we're to keep new lives in these irreplaceable buildings. The Conservancy is one of the few groups in the country offering grants and technical help to landmark religious institutions. 4 years ago, we began what we call our Sacred Sites Open House Weekends. The 5th will be this May 16th and 17th. Dozens of New York City religious buildings will be open to visitors. You visit great religious buildings when you travel. Some of our institutions rival anything you will see in Europe. So we encourage you to check our website prior to this weekend and go out and see who is open and explore. Now, as you know, the mayor's priority is affordable housing and new housing to accommodate population growth. He is one of those who says that neighborhoods will have to get used to being denser. The administration recently proposed a sweeping upzoning that could affect the character of neighborhoods across the city. The plan would affect contextual zones where neighborhood character is protected by restrictions on the height and bulk of new buildings. All those black lines are contextual districts across the city. Contextual zones cover some 64% of the Upper East Side, more than half of the Upper West Side, portions of the Lower East Side in Greenwich Village, and much of brownstone Brooklyn. Residents fought for years for contextual zoning and often agreed to higher buildings on the avenues to protect the residential side streets. The administration calls its plan affordable and quality housing, but it doesn't guarantee either. In fact, the plan would allow developers to build taller market rate housing. Landmark West has shown what could happen to the non-contributing building at the center of this block if the zoning passes. There goes that neighborhood. The unity of the block is destroyed. And here's what could happen on a current low-rise commercial site on Upper Broadway. It's a startling change. Contextual districts often overlap with historic districts, like in Park Slope. So proponents say, don't worry, the Landmarks Commission will protect those areas. But this plan would make LPC the bad guy. They would have to say no to developers, or eventually be forced to approve buildings they wouldn't consider now. This plan is the answer to Rebney's prayers. Unfortunately, most people have no idea that this is happening and what could happen to their neighborhoods, and the city's doing little to publicize it. Preservationists, community boards, and even affordable housing advocates are trying to sound the alert. From the Upper East Side to Bedford-Stuyvesant, contextual and historic districts have affordable housing, and they have residents who invested in improving their homes and neighborhoods. The city needs to respect those areas, not damage them. The final danger I'll discuss is the next threat to the Four Seasons restaurant. You may remember that we fought to save the Picasso curtain, which hung there since the restaurant opened in 1959. The good news is that it will soon be displayed in its new home at the New York Historical Society. The bad news is that other changes are now in the works. The Four Seasons was designed by Philip Johnson and is considered one of the loveliest interior landmarks in the country. The building owner is proposing changes that would remove original material and erode the timeless elegance of the space. This is more than just a social hangout for overpriced hamburgers. This international-style beauty was one of the first of its kind in the country, and it's an important example of the maturing of the international style in America. Again, with all these threats, there's little media attention so far, and much of the public is unaware of any of these issues. New Yorkers' demands achieved the Landmarks Law. Now it's up to us to protect it. We have to rally citizens across the city who care about their neighborhoods and about the iconic places that make New York unique. There is much to do. Philip Johnson worked with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis to save Grand Central in one of preservation's biggest victories. Mrs. Onassis's comments then are still relevant today. Here's what she said. "Is it not cruel to let our city die by degrees, stripped of all her proud monuments, until there will be nothing left of all her history and beauty to inspire our children? If they are not inspired by the past of our city, where will they find the strength to fight for their future? Americans care about their past, but for short-term gain, they ignore it and tear down everything that matters. Maybe this is the time to take a stand, to reverse the tide, so that we won't all end up in a uniform world of glass and steel boxes." Thank you very much. Questions?
Can I ask that you wait until the mic arrives? Has anyone got a question?
Well, that was fascinating, and I wouldn't disagree with a word. The issue we have, I think, is a global issue to do with things like the ineffectiveness of the 1964 Venice Charter, which just doesn't do the job. And I look at, across the Atlantic, a company which is 60% American-owned, wanting to demolish Smithfield Market in London. That company invests the pension funds of American professors and school teachers, who I think would be horrified to see what was being done in their name. So I think we have to rewrite the Venice Charter probably, and there are people looking at that actively. New York's problems, I mean, I'm horrified at what's happening around Grand Central Station, because that is World Heritage, that belongs to everyone. You know, we should relate to each other in that way, I think. I'm horrified to see what's happening in the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, to see what's happening in London and Edinburgh. I think we have an international problem that we may have to address at an international level. I fear UNESCO is not cutting the mustard with its World Heritage sites. I just wonder if there's a way we can look at this globally and take it forward, and that, incidentally, was the most brilliant presentation, and I wish we had people in Britain who could put that amount of passion into the way they feel about what's happening in our country too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think it's hard to read the news today and not be appalled by the destruction of global heritage, particularly in the Middle East. But I have a happier story. The State Department has every once in a while sends me abroad. And last October, they sent me to Tbilisi, Georgia. And I had to look where it was, quite honestly, because I had no real sense of Georgia. And an incredible number of people said, "And how far is that from Atlanta?" Quite a ways, it turns out. The people there were part of communist Russia, and since they gained their freedom in 1992, they are so determined to protect their cultural and architectural heritage that it is thrilling to be there. From elected officials to students to people on the street, they're restoring churches that go back to the 5th century. They're restoring the medieval section of Tbilisi. They're looking to our laws. Everybody wanted a copy of our landmarks law. And it was really exciting. It was discouraging to come back here and think, here we are celebrating 50 years and we're fighting away. But it was really wonderful to see an entire country that recognized that preservation was going to be key to their economic health and future. Just a happy anecdote. Yes? Yes.
I wonder if
You couldn't get a slogan together since you mentioned it. Don't be Shanghai. Comment on this 111 West 57th Street building, respected building that shadows the park, and backyard access would make that part.
Well, you know, so many of these buildings were built, are going up as of right. And I think it startled everybody because there was no public process. People complain about our Euler process and how long it takes and how difficult it is sometimes. But normally there's a public process, and at some point in it, people get a chance to at least say what they think of what's happening. And 57th Street kind of sprung up overnight on all of us. So there's the issue of shadows on Central Park. There's the issues of looking at the god-awful, ugly 157 that will be there for a long time in our face, and the other ones that are going to rise up even higher. One of the things that we were concerned about is the rest of 57th Street. 57th Street was once the cultural center of New York, and you have Carnegie Hall and you have some other landmarks, but there are more beautiful buildings on that street, and so for everything that goes up, something comes down. And it's a defined area. So there was a time in New York when the Landmarks Commission and city planning would kind of work together on areas. And it seemed to us that in a street that well-defined, the two groups could go up and down the street and say, here are landmark buildings, and here are development sites, so we wouldn't be surprised. But most of 57th Street is totally out of our control, and there are people who love them. Yes?
Hey, do you think that the agencies are balkanized, that the Landmarks Commission and city planning don't work together?
The question was, are the agencies balkanized, and do landmarks planning and city planning work together? Certainly under Mayor Bloomberg, city planning was the top dog, and they really drove things. And on the other hand, he let the commission under Bob Tierney do a lot of good things. They landmarked more under Bloomberg than under, I think, almost any mayor. But clearly, city planning has always been in the lead, and then landmarks comes along. I'm not sure how it's going to work entirely with Mayor de Blasio, but again, I think the city planning formed Vanderbilt Avenue. City planning went ahead with contextual zoning, which is really going to have an impact on all of us and on preservation. So I would only hope that there's a better chance in this administration for the two to be more equal and to work together, but we'll have to see.
For us who couldn't be at the symposium last evening, could you give us some more of your commentary about what happened last night?
Well, the issue was supposed to be, preservation for the 21st century, and it was an old grudge rematch of, preservationists and Rebney. And it's too bad because, we all love buildings. You can't be in New York and not love buildings. And, we should be able to get along a lot better than we do. I think Rebney starts more of it than the preservationists do, but I'm sure they have another opinion of that. So, Steve Spinola said how landmarking was, crippling the city. Roberta Gratz thought that developers were making a lot of money off this crippled city and seemed to be doing pretty well, and that the argument was essentially about Manhattan. Rebney likes to talk about how much of the city is landmarked and how we're just, coating it in amber and we're turning it into a museum. Something like, 27% of Manhattan is landmarked, but as a city as a whole, only 4%. So Roberta Gratz said, you've got 96% out there, fellas, go to it. But of course, everybody wants to be here. And if you look at Manhattan, it's not as if we stood still. 57th Street is sprouting up for all to see. If you go down the west side, there's another state that grew up there in the last few years in those buildings. I mean, we're bigger than Nebraska. Look at the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront. Not many affordable housing units in all of those, but certainly we are continuing to grow. And preservationists aren't against new development. We look to get wonderful new buildings and future landmarks. But I think for whatever reason, probably because of the success of landmarking, probably because we have done so well, and probably because I think if you could get a vote on this, there are so many more people who appreciate what preservation has done than don't, that Rebney just decided that they had to get something in before Bloomberg left, and that they are now very worried, of course, about affordable housing, so they can, in a sense, get the mayor's favor. So I'm kind of going off, but that's what it was like last night. The old issues, and then this tirade about that we've prevented Madison Square Garden from moving into the Farley Post Office. And Steve Spinola and I were actually on a panel at a Crane's Breakfast about a year ago. And he was going on about how all of the preservation groups couldn't agree on what buildings should be landmarked around Grand Central, and everybody had different lists, and nobody could make up their minds. And I said, well, first of all, Steve, you brought in some guy from out of town to do a study for you, and he wandered around and couldn't find one prospective new building in Midtown East. Did he open his eyes? And I said it wasn't easy, but the landmarks groups got together and we agreed on 16 buildings. There are 73 blocks we're talking about, and we think there should be 16 additional landmarks there. And last night, there he was saying, the landmarks, they couldn't agree. They are 93 here and 42 there and 82 here. And, everybody was upset and everybody had their old issues. You're a much calmer audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a marvelous address to us all and great photographs. One of the great things that's happened between the adoption of this law and now is that the takings issues has receded, and we don't have such claims that everything we're doing is contrary to the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment. But we have a new takings coming, and you had the slides of Superstorm Sandy and the impact on our coasts. And I wonder what you think we need to do about the 20% of the city that the planning department says cannot be defended against the next great storm and storm surge, and how we can begin to work on the landmarks that are in the areas where we will face this storm surge in the future and the sea level rise.
Well, I wish I had a wonderful answer for you. The older buildings fared so much better in Sandy. Parts of Tribeca and areas were flooded, but the buildings were fine. It was the systems that went. On the south side of Ellis Island, all those buildings flooded, systems went, but those buildings, even in the condition that they were in, stood. And it's very difficult in historic buildings because you can't move the boiler up to the 4th floor of your brownstone. I don't have wonderful global answers to that. And I think it goes well beyond, where you rebuild and where you're allowed to build, and how impractical it is sometimes. I mean, they're buying up homes in Staten Island to keep them away from floodplains, but you can't buy up 20% of the people living in New York. So I'm sorry, but I'm at a loss.
Hi, thank you for your lovely talk. I'm from New York. I love New York City history. And I even wrote my thesis on real estate in the Gilded Age. But unfortunately, I'm not so sure that everyone in their 20s like me is as concerned with landmark preservation and with keeping New York's beautiful buildings. So my question to you is, how do we get people my age in their 20s and 30s involved and active in saving New York's history?
Well, I think all the preservation groups are trying to do that in various ways. Some have parties and talks in great old bars. We have a Young Landmarks organization that we try to have focus on lectures, good talks, and interesting people in landmark areas. We had Bob Caro a couple of years ago come and answer questions about the power broker and things. It doesn't have to be always directly preservation, but if you get them in beautiful buildings and interesting topics. And everybody, of course, now does, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all the things that I'll never understand. So we are all doing our best to get out there. But I think the most important thing is to, in a sense, treat your generation like any others and just show them the buildings. I don't know how you can live in New York and not be affected by buildings. You know what it feels like to walk down and feel comfortable in an area or enjoy walking down a certain street, and you know others where you don't. I live in a tiny historic district on the Upper West Side, and fortunately, the areas up there are expanding in historic districts, but even before I started at the Conservancy and was a full-time preservationist, I knew what I felt like walking down some blocks versus others. And I knew when I was in an historic district and when I wasn't. So I think the more we emphasize all the good things that preservation does, the more we emphasize that, I'm just reminded of a statistic. One of the fastest growing areas in the city's economy are all the tech jobs. And it's all the younger generation that are the tech wizards coming in. The 60% of the tech companies are in historic buildings. Google's in a historic building. They want to be in buildings with some character in funky neighborhoods. They don't want to be in, sterile glass boxes somewhere. So I think right there is a terrific indication that whether they think of themselves or as preservationists or not, it's coming in by osmosis. And I think eventually in New York, you get it.
Ms. Breen, thank you very much for your lecture. It was a marvelous lecture. My question is about the Frick collection. The Frick collection is negotiating an expansion into the garden in 70th Street. And at the present time, my understanding is that the Landmark Commission is also involved in the discussion. Can you give us an update of the status of that petition?
Well, first of all, anybody who owns a landmark building and wants to change it is going to start discussions with the Landmarks Commission. It usually does happen at a staff level. And there are more times than we know when the staff prevents something terrible from happening at a building by saying no early on. I think the Frick took a chance by going out in front very early with what their plan was, and I don't think they expected the opposition. And the opposition, I don't know how many emails a week from the opposition, and we haven't heard from the Frick in a long time. They have told us that they've gone back to the drawing boards and that we may not see what their next plans are until the fall. At the same time, other people have told me they have seen things and that basically not a lot has changed. So I think that I think people are concerned because of places like MoMA, which has grown into such a giant thing. And I think there's always a danger when cultural institutions expand. We wanted to give the Frick a chance to kind of explain themselves. We weren't delighted with what we saw in the initial go-round. and we want to see what they present the next time. But I think that this has really galvanized people, unlike, this is the issue of the day, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that little garden is now incredibly well known. I, for one, want to keep ducks there. I love it when the ducks come in the spring. But we'll see. It's a beloved institution. And I think, again, that the director, just as Tony Marks at the public library walked in when the board had already decided that they wanted to change the library, I think Ian Wardropper came in after the board had decided they wanted to expand the Frick. So I think it's a difficult situation. I hope that in this time when they are rethinking, that they are listening to people, that they are reconsidering a way where they can get some needed growth without destroying the garden and without destroying our only real house, cultural institution that is housed like that. Well, there's the Cooper Hewitt. And the Cooper Hewitt just did this incredible redo, all within their landmark building. So we don't know what's going to happen yet, but I hope they're paying attention, and I hope they come back with something that keeps it the treasure that it is.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I missed a little of it. But I wanted to ask, first I wanted to make a comment. It's not really a question, but I work in tourism, and I can't emphasize enough, maybe that's a way to go, how the uniqueness of New York is what brings all the people here. And it's particularly for Europeans, and I like it because it's the closest thing we have to Europe, and it's so important that it not get homogenized and, with generic stuff, and that we have buildings with sidewalks, and you can look up and see, actually see the sky without seeing a big tower. So that's really important for me. I was wondering how many people I discussed this with, and many people, New Yorkers, diehard New Yorkers who love the city. It's sort of like the young woman who spoke about the 20-year-olds, and I agree with that. But many people think, oh, well, New York has always been like that. It's always been about real estate and building, and it's just more of the same. And their argument is that, we can't freeze time. So I just would like to have some retorts to that.
Look at New York today. What has frozen? We have continued to grow. Even within historic districts, the commission has approved wonderful new contextual buildings that respect the area around them. I mean, there are plenty of new buildings even in the historic districts. There's plenty of areas outside the historic districts for growth. Of course, New York has always been a city. There's always been a tension between what we save and what we don't. But there's plenty of room for growth. We've seen enormous growth. And I think that what has people upset about contextual districts, if they're aware that it's happening, is that people have fought so hard. These are the people who have invested in New York. There was a woman on the panel last night who comes from Bedford-Stuyvesant, and she talked about Bedford-Stuyvesant as an area that was one of the first places where they could buy homes and they could invest. And there's a lot of affordable housing there. And all of a sudden, after building up that community for years, this plan is coming along that could change it so much. So I think that people around the city have invested. You know what your neighborhood means to you. You know what your block means to you. And I think if you're in New York, you're looking for what's new and you're looking for what's happening. But there is a stolidity. There's something about knowing that people came here before you and a sense of place that New York provides. Bob Caro spoke once about why he loves Central Park West. He grew up somewhere on Central Park West as a child, went away to school or came back, and he looked at that array of buildings and knew that he wanted to be there. And he says that the older buildings give the constant stream of new New Yorkers and new immigrants, again, whether they're really thinking this way or not, they realize here's a real place. People have come here before us. People have made good lives. People have left us a legacy. And it's a place where I can start my family, I can build my dream, I can have my legacy. And that's what you get from this great collection of architecture. That's what you get from our layers of history. We're always going to grow, we're always going to change, but there is something about the historic areas that constantly fulfill new needs for new generations that really make us New York and make us unique, and we never ever want to lose that.
Peg, thank you so much. And that actually seemed the perfect moment to stop, because I want to think, well, one, our appreciation for all that New York Landmarks Conservancy has done to preserve that legacy, but also your call to action. I'm one of those people who did not realize there were quite so many threats. So, I appreciate that you highlighting it. I want to thank you so much for your wonderful, eloquent introduction and discussion about the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Thank you so much.
And Peg Breen, president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy, speaking on the 50th anniversary of the New York City Landmarks, we would like to thank you. I have to thank you as the executive director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and who is charged with her board in taking care of this wonderful historic structure. I'm a second-generation General Society member. My father planted a seed about this organization early on, and I have to tell you, it stuck with me. I didn't realize I'd come back in this capacity, but here I am. And I thank you for all you do to protect New York, and I also thank you as a native New Yorker. I live in this city, I love this city, and thank you for your tireless efforts on behalf of this, the greatest city in the world. Thank you.
A little memento, Peg.
Suitable for framing.
And we would also like to present to you, this by the way is Meg Stanton, our program assistant, we'd like to present with you library membership. And we would hope that you'll be able to come back and take advantage of the library. And again, our thanks to the New York Landmarks Conservancy and to Peg and to this really important anniversary. But it seems like we've all got to get to work to make sure that we're still celebrating the anniversary properly in another 50 years' time. So, yes.